to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews.
Today we're looking at a very familiar Bible story in 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is one, the battle of David and Goliath, that even still makes it into pop cultural references as you think of watching a football game between the best team in the league and the really crummy team that doesn't deserve a chance. We still hear this used as an analogy today, which is very uncommon as our culture gets further and further away from Scripture. Biblical literacy is very low at this point in time. But this one is still well known. And for our children, this is a very common Sunday school lesson and a common refrain. So we're going to take a close look at this text today. We're going to see how you do at remembering the details of such a well-known account of Scripture and history. And also, I might poke a few holes into the way that this text usually gets unpacked. So, here we go. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? And choose a man for yourself. Let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Was it not but of word? And he turned away from him toward another, and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, Yahweh, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hands of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go, and Yahweh be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day Yahweh will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that Yahweh saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled, and the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite. This is the word of the Lord. So lots to be said about this account. And I took a long time just to read it, so we'll try and keep this as brief, but also as beneficial to you as possible. So as we're looking at this text, you start with Soko, which is a city that's southwest of Jerusalem. So this is Israel's territory. Notice that it belongs to Judah. That's the southernmost tribe of the 12. This is their territory, and the Philistines are simply in it. Their army's just marching through Israel's land. That's been the reputation. That's been the relationship with the Philistines, who have caused them a lot of trouble and oppressed them for a long time. Now, verse 3 gives us a great picture. Really, it helps us to visualize what's going on here. Picture for yourself a valley that's closed off with two hills on either side. It almost becomes like the shape of a bowl. You've got this low land in the middle and these two hills on the sides. The Israelites are lined up on one side. The Philistines are lined up on the other. And key point here, instead of all rushing down into the valley to fight against each other, which happens sometimes in history, here they're doing an ancient war practice, which is instead of all the people fighting, each army chooses a single soldier to fight for it. It's a battle of champions, winner take all. The goal of this kind of warfare, obviously, is to prevent lots and lots of bloodshed. You choose your best, we'll choose our best, and we'll honor the results. Goliath is going to speak this way as he taunts the Israelites in the time to come. Now, we learn a little bit about Goliath, that he comes from Gath, which is a city that has changed hands between the Israelites and the Philistines several times. He's 6 cubits in a span. A cubit is 18 inches roughly. It's the distance between the tip of your elbow and the tip of your middle finger. And so here, the 6 times 18 inches brings you up to 9 feet. And a span means not another cubit, but maybe a hand or something like that. It's 9 feet and then a little more. So he's a little over 9 feet tall. This is a giant of a man. A question for our kids we could ask is, how tall was Saul? What do we know? This is the contrast. Who should have been the champion for Israel? Well, their king, right? 1 Samuel chapter 8, that's what they demanded. That's what they wanted. They wanted a king who would go out into their battles for them, who would fight for them. They got a king, but he's a coward. The text of 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 2, when we meet Saul, tells us that from his shoulders upward, he is taller than any other man in Israel. So he's physically not as big as Goliath, but he's as big as they come for an Israelite. Now we get a little bit about the armor. So Goliath comes out into battle with a javelin, a spear, and we're going to learn of another weapon later. See if the children can get this one. But it's a sword. So he comes into battle with 3 different weapons. David's not going to have any of those weapons, but instead a shepherd's sling. We'll get to that. Now, remember how poorly the Israelites are equipped in comparison. Chapter 13, verse 22 tells us about that only Saul and Jonathan, the king and his son, have swords. No one else has any metal weapon of that kind that's meant for war. So that's important in the text too. 5,000 shekels for the weight of his coat of mail, his armor, that's 125 pounds. And the spearhead that weighed 600 shekels, that's 15 pounds. The tip of his weapon is 15 pounds alone. A weaver's beam is an interesting note. It comes up other places in Scripture as well, that a spear or staff is compared to that. The weaver's beam is the central, the key piece of a large piece of equipment to weave, like a loom today. And so it had to be sturdy, it had to be strong, and it was quite large on these large, weaver's looms that they would have had to have made some of the fabrics and curtains and things in that culture at the time. So just a reference point, a connection, an image to help people to read the text. Verse 11, how does Israel respond to Goliath's challenge? This is a question for our children as we learn that they were dismayed and afraid. Is this okay? Is Israel's response, is the army's response to Goliath okay? The answer is no. So then turn the question. If they haven't already answered, get them to draw it out a little bit more. What's wrong with this response? Why is it not okay? The Israelites are showing a lack of trust in God, that he won't provide for them, that he won't fight for them. That's the opposite of what we're going to see from David, which is why, again, as we see the contrast between Saul and David, these two anointed kings of Israel, David is described as one who follows after the Lord's heart. Faith is involved here, and it's important in this text. Verse 15, David's just an errand boy at this time. He's in Saul's house because of Saul's evil spirit, and playing the music, playing the lyre for him to make him feel better, running back home to take care of the sheep. He's running food back and forth, providing food for his brothers. Families had to provide for the soldiers. That kind of notes how poorly equipped the army is. So David is not a soldier. He's just running errands. And then in verse 16, we learn that Goliath makes this challenge for 40 days, every morning and every evening, twice a day, same challenge, comes out, issues it before the Israelites, challenges them and their God. And the Israelites refuse to stand up. So, as we keep going, David gets to the battle lines. He does what he's been given to do. He goes, he starts talking to some of the soldiers, asking about what he's heard from Goliath, because he was there for one of those challenges. And he learns that the person, this is verse 25, who kills Goliath has from the king the promise of riches, the daughter of the king for a bride, and his father's house is free. That's a tax statement. No more taxes for that family tree is quite a statement to be made, indeed. Now, verse 26, David, as he responds to the people, starts talking in terms of faith. Why are they afraid of this uncircumcised Philistine? So he's uncircumcised. That means he's not a part of the covenant. He's not a person in the Lord's family. He's not part of God's people. So why are we afraid of him? You get the message here already. By defying the armies of the living God, Goliath is not just defying the army, he's defying God himself. David is well aware that it's not going to need to be him fighting this battle. God is going to fight this battle, and we're going to see him use that language. Jealous brother Eliab in verse 28, probably an embarrassment response that he gives to David here. 40 days. He's done nothing. He makes some accusations. You're just a boy who wants to watch the fight. It's like a game to you. That's not why David's there. But Eliab also hasn't responded in faith as he should have. Saul tries to prevent David from going because of his age and his size. He's not anything compared to Goliath. David responds with quite a story in verse 34, 35, 36. He talks about killing lions and bears because he trusted in the Lord. And that's the same with the battle with this Philistine. In verse 36, this will be like one of them. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Yahweh, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. Faith, right there. At that point, what's the king to do? It's been 40 days. Nobody's volunteered. You finally have a volunteer. So he takes it. He sends him. He lets David go to fight. This next paragraph, you usually hear the conversation about this being that the armor is too big for David. There could be a little to that because he's smaller than Saul. But at the same time, That's not what the text actually says. David says that he has not tested them. He's not used to fighting with these. What tools is he used to making use of? That's the conversation point here. And then also the idea that David will in a little bit be picking up the sword of Goliath. So strength isn't necessarily the problem. He's going to use Goliath's sword to execute the champion. Some do cast a little doubt on David with verse 40 that David chose 5 stones instead of just 1. But a quiver full of arrows is a reference to a well-armed hunter elsewhere in Scripture. So not really an issue that I see here with David picking up 5. He's going into battle. He's trusting in the Lord. But he's just filling his bag. He's ready to go as he would be if he were going out to protect his sheep. You could look up videos of a shepherd's sling. YouTube's got some pretty neat stuff. You can see a shepherd from an extreme distance basically take out, fruit, hit a watermelon and just watch it explode on a fence post. I've seen a couple of videos like that. They're neat to watch. Kids would probably enjoy those. But even if you've never seen one, to learn how accurate one can become with one of these slings could be fun. All right, as we get down later, Philistine Goliath curses David by his gods. So Goliath using the names of Dagon and others to curse David. Verse 45, David notes the difference here. Goliath fights with weapons made by man. David fights in the name of Yahweh. Big difference in between those two things. And then verse 47 as well. The battle is Yahweh's. It's not David fighting. It's the Lord who fights for him. Now, if people were betting on a fight, who would they pick? If you're going to bet on this fight between Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, and this little shepherd boy, this youth from Israel, everyone's going to pick Goliath. It's not even a contest. They'd be right about one part of that. It wasn't a contest. It was over before it even began. David won. Now, verse 51, the Philistines flee after David kills Goliath. So much for keeping the word that they would be Israel's servants. The Israelites chased them for 10 miles from Soko to Gath, about the distance there that we're talking about. Now, as we get to the latter part, verse 55, Saul doesn't remember whose family David comes from, even though David serves in his house. But he is trying to keep that promise of the father's house becoming free, tax exemption here. He's got to figure out who to give this to because David has won the battle. Last note here is the idea of how this normally gets taught. Normally you're going to hear this as God will help you fight the Goliaths in your life. That you're David. And if you just have faith, God will help you conquer. Well, if David is going to be anybody in our life, it's not us. Ask your children this question. Who is the hero of the Bible? The answer to that's Jesus. It's not me. It's not me, myself, and I. It's Jesus. Jesus is the hero. Jesus is David in this. So who does that make Goliath? That's actually us. It's our sin. Jesus came to conquer sin, death, and the devil for us. That's the faithful example that comes from this text into the New Testament, is that the Lord has conquered for us on our behalf. So, a bit of a longer show today. We'll get back to normal tomorrow, but it's such a familiar text and much to deal with here. The Lord's blessings be with you.